exciting about it, because now that I remember, was the countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, and I was ready to run home and get out the door.
But I'm trying to say that we dogs ain't such dogs as we think we are.
I'm 29 years old. How old are you?
It was like going to California in a covered wagon. We were all pioneers, and you were aware of it.
Marty, put on the blue suit.
Mom, it's a blue suit or the gray suit. I'm a fat little man, a fat, ugly little man.
You're not ugly.
That's what I am. I'm ugly, ugly on Mama. Please, now, would you please leave me alone? Now, what do you want from me?
We thought that the Marty was based upon a lot on Paddy Chayefsky. Of course, we didn't go up and ask him, because since it was about such a lonely man and such a man hungry for love, it would have been a rather embarrassing situation for all of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Miss Eva Marie Saint.
A lot of us got our start in live television back in the 50s. The hour-long anthology series like Philco Goodyear Playhouse, U.S. Steel Hour, and Studio One was a vast training ground for talented young directors, writers, actors. As a matter of fact, my own professional roots were firmly planted in that training ground. I, too, did a Paddy Chayefsky play called Middle of the Night, and we rehearsed in a ballroom in New York City. Now, that ballroom played an important role in the creation of Marty, as the director, Delbert Mann, recalls.
In the spring of '53, Philco Goodyear Playhouse rehearsed in the ballroom of the Abbey Hotel on 53rd Street and 7th Avenue in New York. During the evenings, the ballroom became a Lonely Hearts Club. I think it was called the Friendship Club, where singles, men and women, came to meet and dance to a little orchestra and have Coca-Cola together and so forth. All innocent pleasures. On the wall were a number of signs, hand-lettered, giving instructions as to behavior and that sort of thing. One of them that always caught my attention said, girls, remember to dance with the man who asks you. Remember, men have feelings too. We were rehearsing a show by Paddy Chayefsky.
Oh, these kind of dreadful little chairs around against the walls. You could almost see Marty's and the girls, like this teacher I played, sitting in those chairs, and signs all over. Please dance when you're asked. Remember, other people have feelings too.
So while I rehearsed the actors, Paddy was wandering around looking at the signs and thinking. And during a break, he came up to me and said, you know, I've got an idea for a show. I think I want to do a story about a girl who comes to a place like this. And I said, fine, Paddy, that's a great idea. Go ahead and write it. In other words, get out of my hair, don't bother me, I got work to do. Went on with the rehearsal. Paddy meandered off for a while, and he came back a little while later and said, no, I think what I want to do is do a story about a guy who comes to a place like this. I said, Paddy, it's great. It sounds like a marvelous story. Go write it. A week later, I came in to start production on my next script. For the first time in all the years of the Playhouse, Fred Coe and I decided that script was unsalvageable. In desperation, Fred phoned Paddy and asked about the play that Paddy said he might write. Paddy said, well, I finished the first act. I'm in the middle of the second act, and I've got the third kind of blocked out in my mind. Fred said, how soon can you finish it? I said, well, a couple of weeks. Fred said, we've got to have it this week. Can you have it ready? And Paddy hummed and hawed and humped around for a while and finally said, all right, I can give you 2 acts tomorrow night. This was Tuesday. I don't know when I can get the third act, but by the end of the week, we got the first 2 acts the following night, very quickly cast, went into production design, costuming, and all the things that had to be done, delayed rehearsals 1 day, and went into the first reading rehearsal with the first 2 acts. Paddy brought the third act with him to the rehearsal. So we were all reading it for the first time together.
I was thrilled because it was a script of superior quality, written by a man of sensitivity and talent, and it was the biggest break for me. It was originally written for Martin Ridd, who was blacklisted at the time, and they didn't know what to do because they couldn't get him cleared. It was during that stupid period of McCarthy, such monsters as that. And all of a sudden, Fred Coe said, I think Steiger could do it, and I did it.
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. The writing it was beautiful. Patty is a great writer.
The memory is still very clear, uniquely clear, of really everybody just kind of looking at each other in silence and saying, is this as good as we really think it is?
The family of Marty was just that. It was a family. They were young, talented, developing people who cared about each other.
Rod Steiger, makes me cry. Rod Steiger has always made me want to put my arms around him. Rod Steiger needs me.
I remember in rehearsals that Rod would weep. You know, tears would run down his face. And I believe I recall Del would not allow him to do it. And when people will see the production, when they will see this version of Marty, they will see that he gets on the verge of it, but the tears were never allowed to fall or run down the cheeks, which of course makes it far more impressive.
Even in dress rehearsal, after dress rehearsal, just an hour before we went on the air, I remember that was the last note that I gave him before going up to the booth and hitting the air, 9 o'clock Sunday night. And Fred and I looked at each other, not quite knowing what was going to happen, and said, well, here we go. And Rod did it. I think it was the best controlled performance that he has ever given in his life.
Next day, I found out, because when I took a walk down the street, truck drivers were yelling, "Hiya, Marty," and I went into a store and somebody says, "Marty, how are you?"
And people always stopped you on the street. The garbage man used to yell out, "Hey, Betsy, saw you on television last night." I'd say, "Hey, garbage man, I'm glad. Did you like it?"
Critic Philip Minoff, in his review of the show, said, "The biggest favor NBC can do for its public is to repeat Marty at the earliest possible opportunity. Tonight, you and I will see Marty for the first time on national television in 28 years. This is the way it happened on that Sunday night in 1953 when America first met Marty."
I'm a second banana to Paul in Bang the Drum Slowly. No, Paul was, there was something about Paul, there still is, obviously, that was very special.
Just ask him, Gus. Oh, I see. That's very nice. Very nice. Keep it up, Wiggin. I've seen wise guys before, wise guy themselves, right out of baseball. You gonna sing with me or get fat and ruin me, huh? What?
I said, Paul, I don't think you got a chance in this business because you look too much like Marlon. Who's going to hire you?
Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Mr. Cliff Robertson.
There was once a wise old baseball pitcher named Satchel Paige who had a saying, "Don't look back, something may be gaining on you." Well, tonight we're going to look back. We're going to look back to a period when television was live and we were all a lot younger. There's an almost mythical quality about the so-called golden age of television. There's some who feel that it was never as good as we thought it was. Well, tonight we're going to find out. At least about one of the classic shows of that era, Bang the Drum Slowly, as adapted by Arnold Schulman from a book by Mark Harris. It starred Albert Salmi, a Broadway actor playing a third-string catcher on the New York Mammoth, who discovers he's dying. And another young actor who had not yet achieved the fame which was going to be his, Paul Newman, as his roomie and narrator.
My first meeting with Paul was in the Actors Studio. He did a scene. And when the scene was over and the class was over, we took a walk down Broadway and we had a little conversation. I'll never forget. I said, Paul, I don't think you got a chance in this business because you look too much like Marlon. Who's going to hire you?
So many of us were just starting out in that era, and I think we all consider ourselves lucky to have had the opportunity to work with such fine scripts and directors. For instance, George Tappard recalls how it was for him at that time.
I was married. I had a boy who at that time I think was about 2-3 years old. And I worked as a motorcycle mechanic part of the time. I worked as a bank clerk 4 to midnight downtown Wall Street. That's a specific thing to see Wall Street and eat autumn at in a dusty office. I think it was $60 a week was the pay.
Live television was tough. It was tough on the performers, it was tough on the technical people, it was tough on the directors. Many directors today have back problems because of the tension of those times. With Dan Petrie, it hit him in another way.
Actually, my biggest problem, and it sometimes took me 2 or 3 days to get over it, was that my forearm right here was just devastated by the end of the show because of the fact I would say take 1, take 2, you know, because it was live and we had several cameras, and I would go take 1, take 2, take 3, 1, 2, and I didn't realize I was doing that so hard that by the end of the show I would have like a tennis elbow every time.
One of the givens of live television was that from time to time during your career, you're going to be faced with Murphy's Law. That is, that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. I can remember nightmares of my own, walking on a set with my fly open in front of 5 million people.
I've had a show, too, where at the end, the mystery was explained by the line, "It was nothing but a schoolboy prank." And the actor said, big camera moves right in on him for a big close-up, and he said, it was nothing but a schoolboy plunk. Fade out. He said, what? It was a what?
Arnold Schulman had to adapt a book which took place all over the country, on baseball playing fields and in hotel rooms, and make it work in about 48 minutes of program time. In one studio, live. Not an easy job.
First of all, the writer had to set up all of the action, the choreography, to enable an actor who's going in this set here to have his scene and give him enough time to run over to the other set. So we had to plan one scene here, then you cut to the camera 2, which would be on the other set with another actor, and give our actor that you just cut away from a chance to run over.
Albert Salmi recalls how you created reality for the audience.
You had to bring the audience, take them to the field, take them wherever you were. For instance, the spitting and the thing, the curving inward and outward. I had to take them up 4 flights of stairs to the 4th floor, the 3rd floor, wherever it was, when actually I was standing on the floor of the studio. But you had to bring them up higher. And it was all part sense memory. You know, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But you worked very hard to make it work.
In the early 70s, Paramount Pictures released a movie version of Bang the Drum Slowly, starring Robert De Niro and Michael Moriarty. But the first time an American audience experienced this play was back on September 26, 1956, as part of the U.S. Steelhouse. This original version hasn't been seen in its entirety since then. And now, for the second time ever on national television, you and I will experience this classic as it appeared live 25 years ago.
Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Mr. Roddy McDowell.
In September of 1955, a play opened on Broadway called No Time for Sergeants. I was in it, in the role of a soldier named Ben. But the star of that show, which was a big, big hit, was a newcomer to Broadway known as Andy Griffith. There are still people today who remember that play with great fondness, and of course it became a movie. But there are very few who are aware that on March 15th, 1955, 7 months before the Broadway opening, the Theatre Guild presented No Time for Sergeants on live television. I was not in it. As a matter of fact, except for Andy, nobody was in the television show that did the stage play. But the reason Andy Griffith was the star of the Broadway version was that against all odds, and in a way that put some 1930s movies to shame, Andy Griffith came out of nowhere to become Will Stockdale, the drawling draftee. But let Andy take us back 26 years and tell us how that happened.
I went in to read for the play, and I was scared to death because I was not an actor. I knew nothing of cameras. I knew not a whole lot about stage. I knew about standing in front of a microphone in the middle of the stage and telling jokes. Pretty well what I knew. And this fellow named James Haggerty read me. And I didn't read well, but I did have the right kind of accent, was more or less the right size and age. And he took me into another room to look at a calendar to see when I would be in town again. Now, there was a lady sitting there in that room. I don't know who she was. I never saw her again to my knowledge. So she said, what do you do? I said, I work nightclub. She said, do you sing? I said, no, I talk. She said, what do you talk about? I said, Shakespeare, opera, ballet. She said, Shakespeare? I said, yes, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet. She said, Hamlet? I said, that's right. She said, do you do it? I said, no, I tell it. She said, well, start. I said, well, Hamlet's named after this young boy Hamlet that appears in the play. And he lived in this castle over in the old country with his mom and daddy, where his daddy was king over this land. And before the play ever opens, Hamlet's uncle killed Hamlet's daddy so that he might gain the throne, and then married Hamlet's mom, and that made him Hamlet's stepdaddy. And all do try to remember that, because you will need it later on. And I don't know, I started doing that monologue. I'd written the monologue a few years ago, and I did it in a nightclub all the time. And I started doing it, and it sounds like a real bad B or C movie, but it actually did happen. Mr. Haggerty left the room and brought somebody else in. That person brought somebody else in, and finally the room filled up. It really actually filled up, and I started getting some laughs because they knew Hamlet, you know. And I started getting laughs, and that lady was laughing. And I wound up doing the whole monologue. It was a long monologue, about 10 minutes long. And when I finished it, I had that part.
The part of Will Stockdale, as Andy played it, had a lot more complexity to it than most people realized.
Will Stockdale is at least one of the most, if not the most, Christ-like character I ever met. In that, I don't mean to compare him with Christ, I mean that he wanted only to give. Will Stockdale never wanted to take. He never wanted anything for himself, and he didn't care what anybody did to him. He might be hurt, but he'd walk away from it.
I did dozens of live television shows, and I can remember how I felt before the ready light went on, and you knew you were on the air. I tell you, it was terrible. One simply never felt ready. Well, you can imagine how Andy Griffith must have felt. This was his very first appearance on live television drama.
I was scared to death. I was just scared to death. I didn't know how you could live for those next few seconds when they say 1 minute. I think they said 45 seconds. Then they said 30 seconds. Then they said 15 seconds. It's like Jesus is coming to get you then.
A couple of days after the show was on the air, the New York Times Review said, as the carefree laboratory technician, Andy Griffith was ideally cast. He has not been seen on television before, and it cannot be said at this point whether he is versatile enough to qualify for other important roles. Well, of course, Griffith proved down through the years that he was not a flash in the pan.
And that role seemed so specialized that it would be hard to tell whether the person who did that and did it well would be able to do anything else or would be able to understand anything else, or whether that person wasn't just that person. I can understand that, and I'm glad it's not true. I've had a real good life. I'm grateful to Will Stockdale for it.
Very few comedies were tried in those 1 hour and 90-minute programs. I suppose primarily because it's very difficult to sustain comedy for that long a period of time. Most of those that were done don't seem to hold up when you look at them today. No Time for Sergeants is different. Levin wrote a superior adaptation. Alex Siegel did one of his usually outstanding jobs of direction. But if there's any one reason for No Time for Sergeants to be included in this example of the best of the golden age, I have to point to Andy Griffith's performance as Will Stockdale. Its honesty, its directness, its reality are what I think make this performance worth watching for a second time all these years later. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that we present No Time for Sergeants as seen that night, March the 15th, 1955.
And John just ripped into him, tore him to shreds, embarrassed him, humiliated him, got him terribly upset, and then said, let's do it again. And they did it, and boy, it took off.
Do you remember? It was a threesome, you and me and Booze, right? Right? Remember? Don't get me wrong, it was great while it lasted.
We can have it back, Joe.
If I'll drink with you, if I'll drink. Well, I won't. That's finished. That's true.
It was raw, it was imperfect in a lot of physical areas, but emotionally, it was honest, I think.
They are not long, the days of wine and roses. Out of a mystic dream, our path and into a small.
Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Miss Julie Harris.
The first thing we better say about tonight's performance is that you're going to be watching a program which was last seen on October 2nd, 1958. I say that because many of you will know The Days of Wine and Roses from the motion picture with Jack Lemmon. But first, J.P. Miller wrote it for live television, for Playhouse 90. So many actors, so many writers and directors and plays started in those days. For an actress like myself coming out of the theater, live television was a way of projecting performers into millions of homes. But oh, what a frightening, awesome feeling to know that every moment was live. You couldn't call back a mistake. You couldn't do a better performance tomorrow night. Each moment was so real and so scary. But as John Frankenheimer, who directed The Days of Wine and Roses teleplay, remembers, it was so exhilarating.
I think the thing that in retrospect I loved most about live television was the fact that we were free to experiment. We were free to try new things. We knew that we had a certain number of shows to do, so that if you fell on your rear end with one of them, you would be back 3 weeks later with another.
Tonight's play, The Days of Wine and Roses, almost never happened. As you watch this splendidly written play, you might reflect back on the circumstances that brought it into being. J.P. Miller, a wonderful writer, recalls for us how it came about.
I was doing a movie at Hecht Hill, Lancaster. It was called The Unforgiven. And they had bought the book because of me, because I said I was going to write a modern Western like there was no Western like it. And I wrote it, and they said, look, why don't you write a, it's so great, we love it. It was for Burt Lancaster. Burt and Kirk are so great in Gunfight at the OK Corral. Why don't you write a part in for old Kirk? You know, that's the start. You got a 180-page script, and you start over and write another star part in. So I said, I can't take it, fellas. I just can't take it. Let me out of here. You know, and I poured my blood into this thing. So I left and came back to New York. And I said I didn't want to be a writer anymore. I just can't take that. So I bumped into Fred Coe on the street. And Fred said, hey, I've been looking for you. I want you to do a show for me. I'm going to do 3 Playhouse 90s, and I want you to do one of them. And I said, Fred, I'm going to buy a boat. I'm going to go out to the end of Long Island. I'm going to be a fisherman. I'm not going to be a writer. I can't take it. These people drive me crazy. They don't really care. He says, well, I care. I want you to do it. I said, I can't do it, Fred. He says, look, think about it. If I want to do something about, something strong, insanity, alcoholism, divorce, something like that. And if you get an idea and you change your mind, call me. I want you to do it. So I went home, told my wife what he had said, went to bed, and I couldn't go to sleep, which happens to me often, unfortunately. And on this particular night, I guess it was good. I got to thinking about an uncle of mine who was a drunk. And some specific scenes popped into my mind. Then I got to thinking about some other things. The next thing you know, suddenly a story came to me. Very simple idea. 2 young people who like to drink fall in love. And they drink together. And eventually, the bottle becomes more important to each of them than they are to each other. I thought, gosh, that's kind of a nice idea. About 1 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't go to sleep. I knew in those days Fred would probably still be up drinking. Bless his heart. So I called him. He was out at East Hampton. I said, Fred, I got an idea. He said, what is it? I told him. He says, write it, Pappy. That was it. That's the way we made deals in those days.
Piper Laurie recalls how she got her part.
I had suffered the biggest trauma of my life up to that point. I had prepared for a play for a year, and I was fired on the 3rd day. Roddy McDowell, who was my leading man, came in the middle of the night on his motor scooter in New York and hollered, Rosie! And he took me off on his motor scooter to help me sort of recover. I was in a terrible state. And he had a dinner party the next night and invited John Frankenheimer and a few other people. And it was that point that John heard I was available for the show. And he said, can I send you a script? So I remember reading the script in Roddy's living room. Roddy was working on his part, leaning against the piano. I made a little sketch of Roddy on the back page of the script, which he still has, I think. I decided to do it, just really for the exercise.
In those days, we took great pains to prepare for a part. After all, on a Playhouse 90, we had the luxury of 3 weeks of rehearsal. But even before rehearsal started, Cliff Robertson was doing his homework.
As I remember, I had something like 6 weeks from the time that I was told I had the role until we started rehearsal. So I, privately, on my own, went down and started attending Alcoholic Anonymous meetings. Very low profile. They didn't know I was an actor. I went in some old clothes. I got so involved in the program that I became eventually kind of hooked. I even had what they call a baby. There was an individual that I would get calls from at 2 and 3 in the morning, and I'd have to run down to his place, which was down at kind of Skid Row in L.A.
But with all of the preparation, John Frankenheimer recalls being concerned about Cliff's performance.
The only thing that really worried me about this show was Cliff Robertson. I never knew if he was really going to be able to do it.
I'll tell you why John was worried about Cliff. I think John saw something in Cliff, and we're mirrored, you know. I think John saw something in Cliff that he himself had, which is a kind of self-protecting device, an unwillingness to be vulnerable. And I think Cliff has gotten over that to a certain extent. Well, he's gotten over it to a great extent now because he's older and so on. But at that time, Cliff had a tendency to internalize his feelings and his acting to a much greater extent. And John couldn't break him loose.
I shared that anxiety with Fred and with J.P. And all of us decided that we had to go with Cliff, and we just had to try and do the best we could.
I remember drawing the analogy to an older boxer who would say to his trainers, just take it easy, I know what I'm doing, I've got 15 rounds to go, and let me pace myself so I don't leave it in the early rounds, I've got something left.
And Cliff, I guess, paced himself beautifully because I never knew he was going to be as good as he was. And I was extremely worried about it.
He was a completely different person during the rehearsals. Air, the moment of air, there was that moment, and he was alive, and we had something really going between us.
When the movie was made, neither Cliff Robertson nor Piper Laurie got to play their parts. And as John Frankenheimer remembers, he didn't get to direct it.
It hurt like hell. It's something I don't think I'll ever get over. I was told that Jack Lemmon didn't think I could direct comedy, and my reply was I didn't think The Days of Wine and Roses was a comedy.
For the past few minutes, you've heard some of the principal creative talents who were responsible for The Days of Wine and Roses, fishing back in their memories over 25 years to remember how it was. I think you'll agree that their memories were vivid. I hope you'll agree that what they created remains just as vivid. So now, here for the second time ever on national television, as broadcast on that night of October 2nd, 1958, is The Days of Wine and Roses.